I walked into my apartment on a Thursday evening in March and there was a family of 4 eating dinner at my kitchen table. Not squatters, not a break-in. They had keys. They had a lease. They looked at me like I was the intruder. The man stood up and asked who I was. I asked who the hell he was. He pulled out paperwork showing he'd signed a lease 3 weeks ago with my landlord, Declan, for this unit. Paid first month, last month, and security deposit. All legitimate, all legal, except I lived here. I'd lived here for 2 years. I called Declan right there in front of them. He was confused as hell at first, then went silent when I explained the situation. Turned out someone named Valerie had contacted him 6 weeks ago, claiming to be my property manager. Said I was moving out end of month, handled everything professionally. She'd even provided documentation, forged documentation with my signature. My signature that I definitely did not put on any termination notice. Declan apologized but said legally his hands were tied. This family had a valid lease. I had 24 hours to remove my belongings before they'd be considered abandoned property. I went numb, just completely blank. The family looked uncomfortable, but they weren't leaving. They'd paid $3,500 for this place. I left, walked outside. My stuff was already on the curb in trash bags, not boxes, trash bags, like garbage. My clothes, my books, my dishes, everything just thrown into black garbage bags and dumped on the street corner. I started going through them right there on the sidewalk and people were staring, but I didn't care. My laptop was gone. My external hard drive with every photo from the last 8 years gone. My birth certificate and social security card that I kept in my desk drawer gone. I had photos of my grandmother before she died. Photos from college, everything. Someone had gone through my apartment and taken things before bagging up the rest like trash. I sat there on the curb for maybe 20 minutes just trying to process what was happening. Then I called my parents, straight to voicemail, both of them. I called my sister Megan. She picked up but sounded weird and said she couldn't talk. She'd call me back. She didn't. Here's the thing about Lawrence and Valerie. They've always treated me like an investment that didn't pan out. I'm 24. I've been working since I was 16. Put myself through community college. Got a decent job in logistics. Never asked them for money after I turned 18. But that was apparently the problem. I was supposed to be their retirement plan and I wasn't playing along. They tried before. 2 years ago, they asked me to co-sign on a car loan. I said no. They got mad. Told me I was selfish. That family helps family. Last year, they wanted me to take out student loans to invest in Lawrence's friend's business opportunity. I said no again. Valerie actually cried and said I'd never appreciated anything they'd done for me. So, I'd been expecting something. Not this, but something. I'd been careful. I monitored my credit every month. I had alerts set up on my bank accounts. I kept my important documents in one place, or I thought I did. Apparently, not careful enough. I stayed at a motel that night. Cheapest one I could find because I needed to conserve money until I figured this out. I kept calling them. No answer. I sent texts. Nothing. I checked their social media and Valerie had posted photos from some beach resort 2 days ago. They were on vacation. They were on a cruise. I did the math. Forged lease termination, collected $3,500 from new tenants, probably told Declan some story about me being irresponsible, needing them to step in. They'd planned this for weeks. They'd waited until I was at work, came into my apartment with the spare key I'd given them years ago for emergencies, took what they wanted, bagged the rest, and handed my home over to strangers. It took me 3 days to track them down. I used a credit card alert app that showed charges in Fort Lauderdale. Called around to cruise lines, found out they'd booked a 10-day Caribbean cruise departing March 18th. They were living it up on my displacement. I drove to the port on Sunday morning when I knew their ship was docking. I waited in the parking lot for 4 hours. I'd taken the day off work. I had nothing but time. When they finally walked out, pulling their luggage, tan and relaxed and laughing, I just stood there next to my car. Valerie saw me first. Her face changed. Not guilty. Annoyed, like I was ruining her good mood by existing. Lawrence walked over and asked what I wanted. I asked where my laptop was, where my photos were, where my legal documents were. He said he didn't know what I was talking about. They just packed my things for me since I wasn't home. I asked why they'd forged a lease termination and stolen $3,500 from strangers. That's when Valerie said it. She looked me dead in the face and told me I was just a tenant in their lives. They made me. They could unmake me. I'd been costing them opportunity for years with my selfishness. This was just taking back what they were owed. Lawrence added that maybe if I'd been a better investment, they wouldn't need the money. But since I insisted on being worthless to them, they had to get creative. The $3,500 was compensation for 24 years of disappointment. I didn't yell, didn't argue, I just smiled and told them to enjoy the rest of their day. Walked back to my car, drove away. Valerie called after me asking what I was smiling about, but I didn't answer. They started calling that night. First Lawrence, then Valerie, then both of them on repeat. I didn't pick up. The voicemails started apologetic, then angry, then desperate. By Tuesday, they were texting me in all caps asking what I'd done. What did I do? Why were they getting calls from banks, from their mortgage company, from Megan screaming about me ruining everything? I'd done exactly what I'd been preparing to do for 2 years. Since the car loan incident, I'd known this was coming eventually. I'd been documenting every financial request, every guilt trip, every threat. I'd been building a file, getting myself in a position where I could respond when they finally crossed the line. And they crossed it. They'd forged documents. That's a crime. They'd stolen property. That's a crime. They'd committed fraud against the new tenants. That's a crime. And I'd reported all of it with documentation, with timelines, with evidence I'd been collecting from their own text messages and voicemails where they'd admitted to previous schemes they tried to involve me in. The banks wanted their money back. The mortgage company wanted an explanation for the fraud investigation. Declan wanted to know if he should sue them for putting him in legal jeopardy. The new tenants wanted their $3,500 back and Megan. Turns out Megan had been in on it. She'd helped them plan it. Thought it was justified because I'd abandoned the family by not helping them financially. Now she was panicking because apparently some of those documents I'd reported had her name on them, too. My phone hasn't stopped buzzing in 3 days. They're begging now, saying they'll be homeless, saying I'm destroying the family, saying I'm cruel and vindictive and they're sorry they'll pay me back. Please don't do this. But I've been waiting for this moment for 2 years and I'm just getting started. Update 1. The voicemails got worse before they got better. Not better for them, better for me because they stopped pretending to be sorry and started showing who they really are. Lawrence left me a 15-minute rambling message on Wednesday, explaining how this was all my fault for not understanding family dynamics. He said when he was my age, he was supporting his parents, his siblings, sending money home every month without question. That's what you do. That's what family means. But I decided to be selfish, to hoard my money, to act like I didn't owe them anything after they'd raised me and fed me and put a roof over my head for 18 years. He kept saying 18 years like it was some kind of contract I'd signed, like they'd done me this huge favor by not abandoning me as an infant, and now I owed them perpetual financial tribute. The math didn't even make sense. They were acting like I'd been living rent-free off them when I'd been paying my own way since I moved out at 19. Valerie's messages were different. She cried through most of them, but there was this edge underneath, this anger that kept breaking through. She'd alternate between sobbing about how I was destroying them, and then suddenly snapping that I'd always been difficult, always been ungrateful, that she'd known when I was 12 years old that I was going to be a problem. 12. She decided when I was 12 that I was going to betray the family someday. I listened to every message, saved everyone, added them to the file. Friday morning, I was at the DMV getting a replacement license since mine had been in my apartment when they cleaned it out. The line was brutal. 45 minutes of standing there with a paper ticket, and I used the time to go through the texts. Megan had sent me 63 messages over 3 days. 63. She started with anger, telling me I was a vindictive piece of garbage. That I'd always been jealous of her relationship with Lawrence and Valerie. That I'd never understood what it meant to be part of a family. Then she switched to bargaining, saying we could work this out. We could all sit down together. She'd mediate. We'd find a solution. Then back to anger when I didn't respond, calling me immature and spiteful and saying I'd regret this when I was older and alone because I'd burned every bridge. But buried in message 47 was the real information I needed. She'd let it slip that she needed this resolved fast because she'd co-signed something with them 6 months ago. And if their credit got destroyed, hers would tank too. She'd actually written it out. I have my own life to protect. Your revenge is hurting me too. So Megan wasn't just helping them out of family loyalty. She'd tied herself to them financially. Whatever scheme they'd been running, she was part of it. I took screenshots, added them to the file. The DMV clerk called my number and I spent 20 minutes getting my new license sorted out. When I walked back to my car, Lawrence was leaning against the driver's side door. Not threatening, just standing there in khakis and a polo shirt, looking exhausted. He'd lost weight. He looked 10 years older than he had at the cruise port. He asked if we could talk. I asked how he'd found me. He said he'd been driving around checking places I might be. The DMV was a guess. I unlocked my car and got in. He grabbed the door before I could close it. He wanted to explain, needed me to understand. They'd been struggling for years, ever since Lawrence lost his job in 2019 and had to take a position making 30% less. They'd refinanced the house twice. They'd maxed out their credit cards. They'd borrowed from Valerie's sister. They were drowning. And every time they'd asked me for help, I'd said no. And they'd started to realize I was never going to help. So, they'd had to get creative. I asked about the laptop, the photos, my documents. He said they'd sold the laptop to a pawn shop for $300, the external hard drive, too. The documents they'd thrown away because they didn't think I'd need them anymore. I could get replacements. The photos were on the hard drive, so those were gone with whoever bought it. He said it so casually, like he'd accidentally donated an old jacket to Goodwill, not destroyed every visual memory I had of 8 years of my life, every photo of my grandmother, every picture from college, every birthday, every trip, every moment I'd wanted to remember, gone for $300. I asked him to move away from my car. He said we weren't done talking. I said yes, we were. He said I was being childish, and this was exactly why they'd never been able to count on me. I couldn't have an adult conversation without running away. I started the engine. He stepped back. I drove to my storage unit where I'd been keeping everything from the trash bags. I'd rented the unit the day after I'd lost the apartment. Spent 8 hours sorting through garbage bags on a Tuesday night, separating what was salvageable from what wasn't. Most of my clothes smelled like they'd been thrown in with food waste. My books had coffee stains and water damage, but I'd kept it all because I might need it for evidence. The storage facility was in an industrial park near the airport, one of those orange door places that's open 24 hours with a key code. I sat in my car in the parking lot and called the detective handling the fraud case. Left a message updating him about Lawrence's admission regarding the laptop and hard drive. The pawn shop sale might be traceable, might be additional charges. Megan called while I was sitting there. I picked up this time. She came out swinging, asked what the hell I thought I was doing. Did I understand I was destroying 3 people over apartment drama? Did I have any idea what this was doing to Valerie's health, to Lawrence's blood pressure, to her credit score and her ability to buy a house next year with her boyfriend, Billy? I asked why she'd helped them. She said she hadn't helped them. She'd just been supportive of them finding a solution to their financial problems. I asked if she knew they were going to forge my signature and steal from strangers. She went quiet for a second, then said they'd told her I'd agreed to move out voluntarily, that I'd said they could sublet the place, that the whole thing had been my idea to help them out. I asked if she really believed that. She said at the time it made sense. I'd been distant lately. They'd said I was planning to move anyway. It seemed like I was trying to help. But now I was acting like they'd committed some major crime when really it was just a family misunderstanding that got out of hand. A family misunderstanding. That's what she called fraud and theft and forgery. A misunderstanding. I asked her about the co-signing she'd mentioned in her texts. She exploded. Started yelling about how I had no right to throw that in her face. That she'd co-signed a car loan for Valerie because that's what family does. They help each other, unlike me, who'd apparently decided at some point that I was too good for the rest of them. The car loan. She'd co-signed for a car loan, which meant when Valerie's credit tanked from the fraud investigation, Megan would be on the hook for payments. And apparently, there was a house purchase planned for next year that required good credit. The timing was destroying her plans. She kept talking, but I wasn't really listening anymore. I was doing math. Valerie had asked me to co-sign a car loan 2 years ago and I'd refused. So, she'd gotten Megan to do it instead. Megan was the backup plan, the fallback investment when I didn't work out. I asked Megan if she'd ever wondered why they'd asked her after I said no, if she'd considered that maybe she was just more useful to them than I was, if she'd thought about what would happen when she eventually couldn't give them what they wanted either. She hung up on me. I sat in the storage unit parking lot for another hour going through bank statements on my phone. I'd pulled my credit report earlier in the week and found 2 inquiries I didn't recognize from last year. Both denied. They'd tried to open credit cards in my name and been rejected because I had fraud alerts set up. They'd been planning this for at least a year, probably longer. My phone rang again. A known number. I picked up and it was the new tenants from my apartment, the wife Stephanie. She sounded nervous and apologetic and asked if we could meet somewhere to talk. She said Declan had told them about the situation and they felt terrible. They had no idea. They just wanted to find a place for their family. We met at a park near their kids' elementary school on Saturday morning, neutral territory. She showed up with her husband and they both looked exhausted. They'd been dealing with calls from lawyers, from police, from their previous landlord asking why they'd broken their old lease so suddenly. The whole thing was destroying them. Stephanie explained they'd paid the $3,500 in cash. They couldn't afford to lose it. They had 2 kids and barely scraped together the money by borrowing from her parents. If they couldn't get it back, they'd have to move in with family and the kids would have to switch schools mid-year. Her husband asked if there was any way I could help them get their money back from my parents, if I could convince them to pay, if I had any influence. I told them I'd reported everything to the police and that restitution would probably be part of any plea deal or judgment. But I couldn't promise anything. I didn't have influence over Lawrence and Valerie. I barely had contact with them anymore. Stephanie started crying. Not dramatic, just quiet tears while her husband put his arm around her. They'd been trying for 3 years to save up enough to rent a decent place, and now it was gone, and they were back to square one because my parents had seen them as marks. I gave them the detective's contact information, told them to document everything, file their own report, push for restitution. They thanked me, but they looked defeated. I drove back to the motel I was staying at. Still hadn't found a new apartment because my rental history now showed an eviction, and most landlords wouldn't touch me. The motel was costing me $900 a month, but it was all I could get without a lease check. There were 17 new voicemails when I got back. 14 from Valerie, 3 from Lawrence. I listened to them while I ate drive-through food in the motel parking lot. Valerie had found out about the pawn shop inquiry. She was furious, screaming about how I was trying to put Lawrence in jail over selling property that was basically already abandoned. How I was twisting everything to make them look like criminals when they were just trying to survive. How she'd talked to a lawyer who said I was harassing them and they could get a restraining order if I didn't stop. Lawrence's messages were different. Quieter, he said they'd already spent the $3,500 on the cruise and other debts. They couldn't pay back the new tenants, even if they wanted to. Their savings were gone. Their credit cards were maxed. They were 2 months behind on the mortgage, and if this kept going, they'd lose the house. Then he said the thing that made me turn up the volume. He said, this was all happening because I'd never learned the most basic truth about family. That your parents make sacrifices for you when you're young and you make sacrifices for them when they're old. That's the deal. That's how it works. But I'd broken the deal by refusing to sacrifice. So now they'd had to force the issue. He actually said that force the issue like throwing me out of my apartment and stealing my property was some kind of reasonable negotiating tactic. The last voicemail was from Megan. She wasn't yelling this time. She sounded calculated. She said she'd been thinking about everything and she'd realized I was probably recording all our conversations and saving everything for the case. She wanted me to know that if I tried to use anything she'd said against Lawrence and Valerie, she'd testify that I'd been planning to hurt them for years, that I'd told her multiple times I wanted revenge for being asked to help family, that I'd been waiting for an excuse to destroy them. She'd thought it through. She was going to paint me as the villain who'd been planning this all along, which was actually true. Who I had been preparing for 2 years, but not the way she'd tell it. She'd make it sound like I was unstable and vindictive instead of protected and prepared. I saved the voicemail, added it to the file, sent it to my lawyer. Then I opened my laptop and started going through property records. The house Lawrence and Valerie owned wasn't just mortgaged, it was double mortgaged. They'd taken out a second loan 8 months ago. The documents were public record, and according to county records, they were 3 months behind on the second mortgage, not 2 like Lawrence had claimed. 3 months, 12 weeks of missed payments. They were way closer to foreclosure than they'd admitted. I pulled up my email and started typing, not to them, to the bank holding their second mortgage, asking about their foreclosure timeline and auction procedures, attaching my contact information in case they needed to reach me about the property. Because here's what Lawrence and Valerie didn't understand. They'd made this about survival, about whose needs mattered more, about forcing the issue. But I'd been ready for this for 2 years, and I was going to show them exactly what forcing the issue actually looked like. Update 2. The bank responded faster than I expected. Not to me directly, but I started getting notifications through the county property portal I'd signed up for. The foreclosure proceedings had accelerated. They'd moved from 3 months delinquent to active foreclosure status in under a week, which meant Lawrence and Valerie had missed another payment or the bank had decided they were too high risk to work with anymore. I'd been staying at a different motel across town, cheaper than the first one, trying to rebuild my savings after the apartment disaster. I was working overtime every chance I got, picking up weekend shifts, anything to bank money for what was coming because I'd made a decision 2 weeks ago when I contacted that bank and I was going to need capital. Valerie showed up at my work on a Monday afternoon. I was in the warehouse doing inventory when my supervisor came back and said someone was asking for me at the front desk. I walked out and there she was standing in the lobby in business casual like she was there for a meeting, not to ambush her son at his job. She asked if we could talk outside. I said no. She said she'd driven 40 minutes to see me. The least I could do was give her 10 minutes. I told her she could talk right there in the lobby or leave. She chose to stay. She wanted to know what I'd done with the bank. What I'd told them. Why they'd suddenly stopped returning her calls and started sending foreclosure notices. I asked why she thought I had anything to do with that. She said because the timing was too perfect. Everything had been fine until I started my revenge campaign. Now suddenly they were losing their house. I pointed out that fine people don't miss 3 mortgage payments. She said they'd been working on a payment plan. They'd been making arrangements. The bank had been cooperative until someone poisoned the well. She kept saying someone. Like she couldn't bring herself to directly accuse me while standing in my workplace. I asked if she'd come all this way just to blame me for their financial problems or if she had an actual purpose. She said the purpose was to ask me to stop. To please stop whatever I was doing because it wasn't just hurting them anymore. It was hurting Megan. It was hurting the whole family. It was going to leave them with nothing. I asked where my laptop was, where my photos were, where my 8 years of memories had gone. She said they'd already apologized for that. They'd said they were sorry. What more did I want? I told her, sorry doesn't bring back photos of my dead grandmother. Sorry doesn't replace my birth certificate and social security card. Sorry doesn't unforge my signature or unsteal that family's $3,500. She started crying right there in the lobby. Not quiet tears like Stephanie at the park. Full sobbing. My supervisor was watching from the doorway to the warehouse. The receptionist looked uncomfortable. Valerie was making a scene and she knew it. She said I was killing her. Actually said those words. That the stress was killing her. That she couldn't sleep. Couldn't eat. That she was having panic attacks every time the phone rang because it might be another creditor or another lawyer or another threat. That Lawrence was falling apart. That their marriage was suffering, that they'd done one thing wrong and I was destroying their entire lives over it. One thing wrong. That's what she called it. One thing. I told her she needed to leave. She said we weren't finished. I said yes, we were. And if she didn't leave, I'd call security. She left. I went back to work, but I couldn't focus. Kept replaying her standing there crying, playing the victim, acting like they'd made one mistake instead of executing a planned scheme they'd been working on for months. My supervisor pulled me aside during break and asked if everything was okay at home. I said it was fine, just family drama. He said if I needed time off to deal with it, I should let him know. I said I was good. That night, Megan sent me a long message on Instagram, not texts anymore. She'd switched to Instagram DMs, like that would somehow make it more personal or harder for me to ignore. She said Valerie had told her about the confrontation at my work, and she was appalled that I'd refused to even have a conversation with my own mother. That I was so consumed with revenge I couldn't see I was destroying real people with real lives. She said Billy had been asking questions about why her credit score had dropped 20 points in 2 weeks, about why she was stressed all the time about what was going on with her family. She'd been lying to him, telling him it was nothing, but he was starting to figure out something was seriously wrong, and if this kept going, it was going to ruin her relationship. Then she wrote something that made me screenshot the whole conversation. She said maybe I'd been right to refuse to help them financially over the years. Maybe she should have done the same because now she was tied to their sinking ship and I was the one drilling holes in the hull. She said she'd co-signed that car loan because Valerie had begged, had cried, had said they'd lose their transportation without it. And now Megan was getting payment reminder notices because Valerie had missed 2 car payments along with everything else. 2 car payments on top of the mortgage issues. They were defaulting on everything. I wrote back asking what else she'd co-signed for. She read the message but didn't respond for 3 hours. When she finally replied, she said it was just the car, nothing else. And why did it matter anyway? I told her it mattered because if she'd co-signed for anything else, she needed to protect herself now before their credit destruction dragged her down completely. She told me I was being paranoid and dramatic. Then she asked if there was any way I could talk to the prosecutors about dropping the charges, if I could tell them I'd change my mind about pursuing the case, if I could just let it go and give them a chance to pay back what they owed over time. I asked if she was serious. She said, desperate people do desperate things, and if I pushed them into a corner with no way out, I needed to be prepared for what might happen. I asked if that was a threat. She said, no, it was a warning that I was playing with fire, and eventually I'd get burned. I stopped responding, but I screenshotted everything and sent it to my lawyer. The foreclosure auction got scheduled for 3 weeks out. The notice appeared in the county records and in the legal section of the local newspaper. I'd been checking daily. The property would go to auction on a Friday morning at the courthouse steps. Minimum bids set at the outstanding loan balance plus fees. I'd been saving every dollar I could, working 60-hour weeks, eating dollar menu food, staying at the cheapest motel I could find because I'd done the math and I knew what I needed. Lawrence called me from an unknown number on Wednesday. I almost didn't pick up, but something made me answer. He sounded different, defeated. He said they'd hired a lawyer to try to stop the foreclosure, but the lawyer had told them they didn't have grounds. They'd missed too many payments, broken too many promises to the bank. They were out of options. He asked if I knew anything about the auction, if I'd been monitoring it. I said public information was public. He said, right, public, so I'd seen it. He asked if I was planning to do anything about it. I asked what he thought I should do. He said a good son would help his parents keep their home. A decent human being would show mercy. I hung up. Megan called me an hour later from her own phone. She'd been talking to Lawrence and Valerie, and they'd all agreed they needed to sit down with me face to face, all 4 of us, and work this out like adults. No lawyers, no police, just family. She said she'd mediate. She'd make sure everyone got to speak. We'd find a solution. I asked what solution she thought existed. She said maybe I could loan them money to catch up the mortgage. Maybe I could co-sign or refinance. Maybe I could talk to the bank on their behalf since I'd apparently been in contact with them. I asked why she thought I'd do any of that after what they'd done. She said because they were family and family forgives. I told her, forgiveness requires remorse. She said they were remorseful. They'd apologized multiple times. I said apologizing while continuing to manipulate and threaten and try to extract money wasn't remorse. It was just another con. She hung up on me. Sunday morning, I was at a laundromat washing my work clothes when Lawrence walked in. Not a coincidence. He'd been tracking my location somehow, probably through Megan, who might still have access to my old Find My Friends settings I'd forgotten to remove. He sat down next to me while I was folding shirts. He said we needed to have a real conversation, man to man, without all the drama and emotion. He said he understood why I was angry. If he was in my position, he'd probably be angry too. But anger was a luxury neither of us could afford right now because the situation had escalated beyond what either of us wanted. I asked what he thought I wanted. He said he thought I wanted them to suffer, to feel what I felt, to lose what I lost. And he got that. He really did. But there had to be a point where enough was enough. They'd lost their savings. Their credit was destroyed. They were losing their house. Valerie was having health problems from the stress. Megan's relationship was falling apart. How much more did I need before I'd be satisfied? I asked if he remembered what he said at the cruise port, about me being a tenant in their lives, about being able to unmake me. He said he'd been angry. He'd said things he didn't mean. I asked if he remembered what Valerie said about me being just a disappointment and an investment that didn't pay off. He said she'd been stressed and emotional. I told him those weren't things you say in anger. Those were things you say when you mean them, and the anger just makes you honest enough to admit it. He said I was wrong. They loved me. They'd always loved me. They just made a mistake in how they showed it. A mistake. Still calling it a mistake like they'd accidentally hurt me instead of deliberately planning to exploit me for months. He said the auction was in 10 days. If it went through, they'd be homeless. They'd have to move in with Valerie's sister in another state. They'd lose everything they'd built over 30 years. He asked if I could live with that, if I could really look at myself in the mirror, knowing I'd destroyed my parents' lives. I told him they'd destroyed their own lives by treating people like assets and getting mad when the assets didn't perform. He stood up and walked out. That afternoon, Valerie posted on social media. First time in 2 weeks. A long emotional post about family betrayal and how sometimes the people you sacrifice everything for turn around and stab you in the back. She didn't name me, but everyone would know. She talked about ungrateful children and the pain of watching someone you raised become a stranger. She talked about facing homelessness and financial ruin because of vindictiveness and revenge. The comments were mixed. Some people were supportive, saying family should always come first, asking what had happened, offering prayers. But some people pushed back, asked for context, said there must be more to the story. One of her coworkers from 10 years ago commented asking if this was about me, and if so, what had they done to make me this angry because the kid she remembered was gentle and quiet and not the type to hurt people without reason. Valerie deleted the post 2 hours later, but I'd already screenshotted it. Megan called me that night and absolutely unloaded. Said I'd humiliated them publicly by forcing Valerie to delete her own post. Said I was controlling the narrative by playing the victim when I was actually the aggressor. Said Billy had seen the post before it was deleted and had asked direct questions she couldn't dodge anymore. She'd had to tell him about the apartment, about the fraud charges, about the foreclosure, and he'd said he needed time to think about whether he wanted to be involved with a family that had this much chaos. She was crying angry tears, the kind where you're too mad to be sad, but too hurt to just be angry. She said I'd done this on purpose, waited until she was serious with someone, until she had something to lose, and then destroyed her family's reputation so she'd lose it. She called me calculating and cruel, and said she'd been wrong about me my whole life. She'd thought I was just shy and awkward when really I was cold and vindictive. I asked if she was done. She said, no, she wasn't done. She was just getting started. She said, when this was all over and Lawrence and Valerie were homeless and broken, I'd still be alone with no family left. She said I'd win the battle but lose the war because I'd sacrificed every relationship I had for revenge. She said someday I'd regret it when I was older and had no one. I told her she'd made her choice when she co-signed that car loan. When she helped them plan to sublet my apartment when she chose their side without asking for mine. She said there weren't sides, there was just family, and I'd removed myself from the family the day I decided revenge was more important than forgiveness. I hung up and blocked her number, blocked her on Instagram, blocked her on everything. The auction was in 9 days. I'd saved $47,000. It wasn't enough to buy the house outright, but it was enough to be a serious bidder if the minimum bid stayed low. I'd been in contact with a real estate attorney about the process, about what happened if I won, about what rights the current occupants had. They'd have 30 days to vacate after the sale, 30 days of watching me own the house they'd lived in for 26 years, 30 days of packing up their life while knowing I'd won. I got an email notification from the county portal that night. Someone had filed a motion to delay the auction. Lawrence and Valerie, represented by their lawyer, claiming financial hardship and requesting a 60-day extension to arrange alternative financing. The hearing was set for Monday morning, 3 days away. I forwarded the email to my lawyer and asked if we could attend. He said yes, and he'd make sure the prosecutor's office knew about it too, since the fraud case was still pending. Multiple jurisdictions, multiple legal actions, all converging at once. Lawrence and Valerie were about to stand in front of a judge and explain why they deserved more time to save their house while simultaneously facing criminal fraud charges for what they'd done to get money in the first place. And I was going to be sitting in that courtroom watching it happen. Final update. The courthouse on Monday morning was exactly what you'd expect. Fluorescent lights, hard benches, people in cheap suits shuffling papers. I sat in the back row with my lawyer while Lawrence and Valerie sat up front with theirs. They didn't know I was there until Valerie turned around and saw me. Her face went completely white. Their lawyer was young, maybe 2 years out of law school, and he was not prepared for what he was walking into. He presented their motion for a 60-day extension, cited financial hardship, mentioned they were actively seeking refinancing options, had a payment plan proposal ready, standard stuff. The judge looked bored. Then the prosecutor's office representative stood up. She introduced herself and explained that Lawrence and Valerie were currently under investigation for fraud, forgery, and theft, that they'd obtained $3,500 through false pretenses and had disposed of stolen property, that granting them additional time would potentially allow them to hide assets or flee jurisdiction. She recommended the motion be denied. The judge asked Lawrence and Valerie's lawyer if he was aware of the criminal investigation. He stammered something about just learning about it that morning. The judge asked Lawrence and Valerie directly if they disclosed the investigation when they hired him. Valerie said they didn't think it was relevant to the foreclosure. The judge said everything was relevant when you're asking the court for favors. Motion denied. Auction would proceed as scheduled Friday morning. Lawrence tried to approach me in the hallway. After my lawyer stepped between us and said any communication needed to go through proper channels. Lawrence said he just wanted to talk to his son. My lawyer said his son had nothing to say. We left. I got 43 messages over the next 3 days. Voice, text, Instagram DMs from accounts I didn't have blocked yet. Even a Facebook message request from Valerie's sister asking me to reconsider what I was doing to the family. I didn't respond to any of them, but I read every single one. The desperation was escalating. Tuesday night, Valerie left a 20-minute voicemail that started with begging and ended with her screaming that I was going to hell for what I was doing to them. Wednesday morning, Lawrence sent a text saying they'd talk to a bankruptcy lawyer, and if I didn't back off, they'd file Chapter 7 and I'd get nothing. I forwarded it to my lawyer, who explained that bankruptcy wouldn't help them at this point. The criminal charges were non-dischargeable, and the foreclosure was too far along. Thursday afternoon, Megan sent me a paragraph saying Billy had broken up with her, not paused, not taken a break, ended it. He'd said he couldn't deal with the drama and the lies and the constant crisis. She said this was my fault. I destroyed her relationship by destroying her family. And she hoped I was happy. She said she'd lost the person she thought she'd marry because I couldn't let go of an apartment. An apartment. Still minimizing it. Still acting like they'd borrowed $20 without asking instead of committing multiple crimes and destroying my life. I didn't respond to her either. Friday morning, I was at the courthouse steps at 8:45 a.m. The auction started at 9. There were maybe 15 people there, mostly real estate investors with clipboards, checking comparable sales. Lawrence and Valerie showed up at 8:50 a.m. with their lawyer. When Valerie saw me standing there with my checkbook, she actually gasped. Lawrence walked over and asked what I was doing. I said I was there for the auction. He said I couldn't be serious. I said I'd never been more serious about anything. He said buying their house would be cruel and vindictive and prove I was exactly the person they'd always worried I'd become. I said they'd made me this person when they decided I was just an investment that didn't pay off. Valerie was crying before the auctioneer even started talking. The minimum bid was announced at $167,000, which was the outstanding balance on both mortgages plus fees. 3 investors bid immediately. I waited. The price climbed to $178,000. One investor dropped out, then $185,000. Another dropped out. It was down to me and one other guy older. Looked like he flipped houses for a living. He bid $190,000. I bid $195,000. He looked at me, looked at Lawrence and Valerie standing there watching, put it together, he shook his head and walked away. Nobody was going to outbid someone with that kind of personal investment in winning. The auctioneer called for other bids twice. Silence. Sold for $195,000 to me. Lawrence made a noise I'd never heard him make before. Not crying, not yelling, something between the two. Valerie sat down on the courthouse steps. Their lawyer was talking to them, but I couldn't hear what he was saying. I paid the deposit right there. The full balance was due in 30 days. I had it. Every dollar I'd been saving for 2 years, every overtime shift, every weekend I'd worked instead of having a life. I had exactly what I needed. The paperwork said they had 30 days to vacate. My lawyer immediately filed for a court order reducing it to 14 days due to the fraud case and their criminal behavior. The judge granted it 14 days to pack up 26 years and leave. That's when the messages got truly desperate. Not just begging anymore. Panic. Real actual panic. Valerie called me from the courthouse parking lot saying they had nowhere to go. Valerie's sister had said they couldn't stay there anymore because she didn't want to be involved. Their friends weren't returning calls. They'd checked rental prices and with their destroyed credit, they couldn't qualify for anything. They were going to be homeless. She kept saying homeless like I was supposed to care. Lawrence sent me a message that night saying I'd won. I'd beaten them. I'd taken everything. Was I happy now? Did I feel powerful? Did it fix whatever was broken inside me that I needed to destroy my own parents? He said they'd always known I was different, even when I was a kid. Something was off. They tried to raise me right, but some people just don't have it in them to be good. Some people just don't have it in them to be good. That's what he said about me. After forging my signature and stealing my property and throwing my life into trash bags, Megan sent a long DM saying she'd finally seen the whole picture, that I'd been planning this for years, that I'd been preparing and waiting for them to give me an excuse, that I was dangerous. She said she was telling Billy's family and her friends and anyone who would listen what kind of person I really was so they could protect themselves. She said I was dead to her, completely dead. She'd rather have no brother than have me. I screenshotted it and added it to the file. The fraud case moved forward. The prosecutor offered a plea deal. Lawrence and Valerie would plead guilty to fraud and theft charges, pay restitution to Stephanie and her family, do community service, and be on probation for 3 years. If they refused and went to trial, they were looking at potential jail time. They took the deal. They had to. They had no money for a trial lawyer, and the public defender told them it was their best option. Restitution was set at $3,500 plus court costs. They had 90 days to pay. With what money, I don't know. Their bank accounts were empty. The car Megan had co-signed for got repossessed 2 days after the auction. Their credit cards were all maxed and in collections. Megan got hit with the car loan default on her credit report. She sent me one final message saying her credit score had dropped 90 points and she couldn't qualify for a mortgage for years now. That Billy's family had told him he'd dodged a bullet by leaving before he got more involved with her family. That she'd lost everything because of me. I didn't respond, but I read it 3 times. Day 12 of the 14-day eviction notice. Lawrence called from yet another new number. I picked up. He sounded exhausted. He said they'd packed everything they could, fit into a storage unit they'd rented with money borrowed from Valerie's coworker. The rest they were leaving behind. They'd found a room to rent in someone's basement 2 counties over. Month, $800 a month for one room with a shared bathroom. Both of them in one room. That's what they had left. He said he understood now that I'd been hurt worse than they'd realized. That maybe they'd miscalculated how much the apartment meant to me. That maybe they'd been wrong to think family money should flow both ways without question. But this punishment was too much. Taking their house, destroying their credit, ending Megan's relationship. It was too much for what they'd done. I asked him if he remembered telling me they could unmake me since they'd made me. He was quiet for a long time. Then he said yes. I told him I'd spent 2 years making sure nobody could unmake me. Not them, not anyone. And now they knew what it felt like to be unmade. He hung up. They moved out on day 14. I drove by the house that evening and saw them loading the last boxes into a rented van. Valerie was sitting on the front steps looking at the house like she was memorizing it. Lawrence was moving slow, like he'd aged 20 years in 3 weeks. I didn't stop. I didn't say anything. I just drove past. I spent the next week getting the house appraised, getting repairs quoted, meeting with property managers. The house was worth about $240,000 in current condition. I'd bought it for $195,000. If I fixed it up and sold it, I'd make profit. If I rented it out, I'd have income. Either way, I'd won. Stephanie and her husband got their $3,500 from the restitution payment plan. It took Lawrence and Valerie 3 months to pay it all, but they did. They had to. It was part of their plea deal. Stephanie sent me a message thanking me for pursuing the case, saying the money meant they could start saving again for a real place. Megan stopped contacting me entirely after that final DM. I heard through a mutual acquaintance that she'd moved to a different city, was trying to rebuild her life away from Lawrence and Valerie. The acquaintance asked if I felt bad about what had happened to her. I said no. She'd made her choice when she co-signed that loan and helped them plan my displacement. She decided I was an acceptable loss for their financial gain. Now she knew what it felt like to be the loss. I moved out of the motel 6 weeks after buying the house. Found an apartment in a better area, better building, better landlord. Went through the whole application process with my rebuilt documents and references from work. The landlord asked about the previous eviction. I explained the fraud case, showed him the police reports, showed him the court documents clearing me. He accepted it. My new apartment is smaller than the old one, but it's mine. Really mine. Nobody has keys but me. Nobody can forge anything because I monitor everything daily. I have alerts on every account, every credit line, every legal document. Nobody will ever displace me again. Lawrence and Valerie are still living in that basement room 2 counties over. Still on probation, still dealing with destroyed credit and collection calls and the fallout from their choices. Valerie had to take a part-time job at a grocery store because Lawrence's salary isn't enough to cover everything. They're in their 50s doing the kind of financial struggling they thought they'd escaped decades ago. People ask if I feel guilty, if I regret pushing it this far, if I think about forgiving them now that they've suffered enough. I don't feel guilty. I don't regret anything. And they haven't suffered enough because suffering implies undeserved pain. This is just consequences. They looked at me and saw an investment that failed. A tenant in their lives who wasn't paying enough rent, someone they'd made and could therefore unmake when convenient. I looked at them and saw people who'd been circling for years, waiting for the chance to exploit me, who'd been planning and scheming and building up to this, who'd crossed every line thinking I'd never push back. They were wrong. I'm 24 years old. I own a house. I have savings. I have a plan. And I have a family that consists of exactly one person. That's all I need. Welcome to Hidden Lies, where we expose the shocking truths people try to bury. If you enjoyed this story, hit that subscribe button and turn on notifications so you never miss an upload. Share your own experiences in the comments below. We read every one. Thanks for watching.